Welcome to Broadway Buzz. I really apologize for not being with you today. Actually, I'm flying to Hong Kong to join a ship that will go around the world and end up in Dubai. I had to miss 2 days of the series that we had of Buzz this time, so please forgive me, and I promise to be live next time. In any case, we're here to talk about a very exciting show, Xanadu. Now, keep in mind, Xanadu the musical is based on a movie that had probably the worst press any film has ever had. It won all of the Razzles that year for the worst of everything. Isn't it ironic that a producer would pick a movie that had such a bad premiere, and then he would create a workshop of the musical that had very bad word of mouth? The week before the show was ready to open in New York, the leading man broke his leg, and yet when the show opened, the critics arrived with hatchets and they arrived with shovels. First, they were going to hatchet it to death, and then they were going to bury it that night. And lo and behold, what happened is they loved the show. And the show ended up running 500 performances on Broadway. It's doing a very successful national tour. It is about to open in South Korea, Australia, and its West End debut in London is happening next month. So much for bad word of mouth about a show in previews before it opens. There is a very magical tale about the development of this show, and I would like to go back and start with the movie itself, the infamous movie, and talk about what went wrong with that show, and then move on to how it was turned into a Broadway hit. Okay, we're back in 1980. The movie Xanadu was presented starring Olivia Newton-John and Gene Kelly. It had very exciting music, and basically, when the show opened, the critics assaulted it and called it the worst movie ever made. In fact, it really sort of stopped Hollywood from being interested in creating movie musicals, and it very seriously damaged Olivia Newton-John's career. Well, let's just start with the title of the show, Xanadu. The title really comes from a wonderful work called Kubla Khan, which was written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. We all read it in high school. And it, of course, was our first sort of look at exotica. And Samuel Taylor Coleridge created this sort of pleasure dome in China that he named Xanadu. So, you know, as young people, we all decided that we wanted to find our own Xanadu, of course. Now, I do have to tell you, what your teachers probably didn't tell you when you read that epic work, Kubla Khan, is that Samuel Taylor Coleridge was seriously addicted to opium when he made the famous poem. Now, ironically, of course, when Hollywood decided to make a movie, the only serious thing they took from the Kubla Khan was, of course, the title, Xanadu, and then they took the advice of sniffing, snorting, and whatever happened in Hollywood in the early 1980s. I really don't know. But in any case, they made this disconnected, disjointed movie that basically was plotless. The simple story of it is a goddess comes down from the heavens. She renames herself Kira. Keep in mind, she's coming from Greek mythology, so she's a Greek goddess. She renames herself Kira. She decides to visit Venice Beach, California, in the 1980s, and she decides to be the muse or to stimulate a young artist who wears cutoff shorts and who likes to roller skate and whose greatest artistic dream is to create a roller disco. So you understand, even from the premise of the movie, that this is very lightweight stuff. And of course, no one questioned the idea that Olivia Newton-John, playing a Greek goddess, should do the whole performance in a very heavy Australian accent. So already we had the makings of a camp movie. And then sadly, this would be Gene Kelly's last movie. As you know, Gene Kelly gave the world some of the most phenomenal movie musicals. He created some of the greatest choreography that was ever put on film. and sadly, this would be his last movie. The movie basically was based on two early Rita Hayworth movies that were sort of, the idea was a goddess came down to earth, fell in love with a mortal, and that was the story. So they borrowed that idea. And of course, every bit of mythology everywhere in the world always has this story of the goddess falling in love with a mortal and the repercussions of what happens. It's in Hindu mythology, it's in Asian mythology, it's in African mythology, and clearly it's in Greek mythology. So in any case, the movie was made. There was really nothing to be said for it, except that it had very interesting and delightful music. The music would go on to be the head of the charts in the early 80s and become some of the best-selling songs of that whole period. And we have to thank two men for this. John Ferry, who worked very closely with Olivia Newton-John, who developed a lot of her greatest songs in the 70s and early 80s. And the other name is Jeff Lynne. And Jeff Lynne was the head of a very interesting group called the Electronic Light Orchestra. Now, the Electronic Light Orchestra in that period was one of the greatest disco groups and a groundbreaking group to come out and to really transform music. So these two men gave the film very significant substance with brilliant music that would go on to head the charts and would go on to have a long acceptance literally everywhere in the world. So what happened to this movie? It lost money in its initial presentation. The studios just threw their hands up in despair. It was plotless. It wasn't savable. We had Olivia Newton-John, who was the darling of the day, one of my favorite performers, certainly from that period, who sort of skated her way through fog and psychedelic lighting, singing, of course, in a very charming way, and singing delightful and memorable music. Now, what happened to this movie is an interesting phenomenon. You're familiar, of course, with the Rocky Horror Picture Show. That was a movie, again, that was sort of lambasted by the critics, but the audience decided that it was a great underground classic. And if you ever pass Coventry at night over the weekend, you literally see hundreds of kids dressed in Rocky Horror Picture Show costumes with full makeup going in to see the movie. They know every line of dialogue, they know every song, and of course they sing it all at the top of their lungs through the entire showing of the midnight movie. Well, the same thing happened with Xanadu. People very early on decided that the music was so great that it deserved a second showing, and it became really a cult hit. So on any Saturday night or Friday night in the East Village in New York, in Los Angeles, in bohemian sections, even in Soho in London, you could find late night versions of Xanadu playing with an audience loving and adoring every moment of it. Now, let us fast forward to 2001. And let me introduce the name of a young man who would become the primary producer of the show you're going to be seeing today. His name is Robert Aarons. And Robert Aarons was an assistant to a director at Paramount Studios. He had tried to make two films. Neither of them were very successful. So he realized that his film career was a sort of dead-end career, and he knew he had to reinvent himself. He clearly loved the theater and had some background in the theater and had studied theater as a student. So one night, he was in Los Angeles in 2001, and he went to a late-night movie showing of what was called Xanadu Live. Now, Xanadu Live showed the movie of Xanadu, but a very smart producer had hired a group of professional actors, and they would act out the roles, saying the lines of dialogue in front of the movie, and when they would get to the songs, they would raise the volume of the movie, and the actors would lip sync to Olivia Newton-John or Gene Kelly, and it became a major camp happening. Now, this was done illegally. They had the rights to show the movie, but they didn't have the rights to turn it into a live performance. So finally, that sort of happening was closed down. Literally, thousands of people were going to see Xanadu live. Well, what it did, aside from a lot of people being sued for illegally presenting the show live, was that it gave Robert Aarons the idea of turning it into a musical. He would spend the next 5 years of his life getting the rights to the movie to make it a musical. Let me quickly talk about this, since many of our musicals are based on other sources, either plays or movies or short stories. The producer of a musical has to make certain that he has all of the rights so that he will have what will be called the grand rights. Let me explain. In the case of Xanadu, there were obviously the screenwriters who wrote sort of a non-story, and then, but nevertheless, they owned the rights to it. Then, of course, there were the producers who owned the movie rights to it, and then there were the composers who owned the music rights. So all in all, it involved 5 separate entities. So all of those entities had to be worked with. They had to negotiate terms, and they had, in turn, had to agree to give the grand rights to the producer. Now, what are grand rights? Grand rights means that a producer has not only the right to present the show as a musical on Broadway, he will pay a royalty for that, a percentage of the gross. But beyond that, he will have within the grand rights the ability to do a cast recording, the ability to print music, the ability to create singles from the show, the ability to negotiate the sale of a movie version of the stage musical. He would also have the rights to negotiate television rights and radio rights. So this is very significant. Remember, in the case of a musical, a majority of the profit doesn't come from its Broadway showing. It comes from the residual rights of touring, of secondary productions, of productions in various cities around the world, in recording rights, in creating singles from the musical, etc. So this is where the money is made. So therefore, the grand rights have to be very carefully tied up. And it took this young man 5 years to create that. Okay, so here we are now in 2006. Robert Aarons has the rights to do it as a Broadway musical. He has a limited amount of time in which to present it. Usually it's a year. So the end result is he had to put together a creative production team to make this happen. What he had basically was brilliant music and a very sketchy storyline. What he really had were characters and characters' names. That's basically it. So the end result is he went to Douglas Carter Beane. Now, Douglas Carter Beane is a wonderful off-Broadway playwright. He had a very interesting career. New Yorkers know him for writing very sassy, very contemporary plays, very often about New York life. One of his shows just opened in the past month off-Broadway called Mr. and Mrs. Fitch, and it stars John Lithgow, and again, had excellent reviews, and it's very much about gossip in New York life. So the end result is New Yorkers knew Douglas Carter Beane. You know him as the book writer and creator of All Shook Up, the musical takeoff on Elvis Presley. But most of all, many of you will know him for a brilliant movie that he made called To Wong Foo, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar. Now, this is a very offbeat movie. This is the movie I recommend that you see, not the original Xanadu. It's a very funny work. Let me tell you how this happened. Douglas Carter Beane, this gives you a little profile of how young artists work off-Broadway as they try to make a career for themselves. He arrived from college being very savvy, very knowledgeable about theater, very idealistic, full of ideas about how to make the theater more interesting and contemporary, how to reach young people. And so he worked in a series of off-Broadway theaters. Usually, the owners of these off-Broadway theaters very often will make the theater available to young artists on Monday night, because that's usually the dark night, the night that a show isn't playing. And if they pay for expenses, they can do workshops of skits they're working on, et cetera. And Douglas Carter Beane did this, and he created a very large New York following. For several years, I went and saw sketches and review clips that he did in these venues. So he supported himself, though, through this period by being a babysitter. Now, the family that he was working for went away for 2 weeks, and they said, "You're such a good babysitter, we don't want to lose you, so we're going to pay you for 2 weeks." So he called his agent and said, "I have 2 weeks free. What am I going to do with my time?" And his very smart agent said to him, "Why don't you try writing a screenplay?" And he said, "I've never written a screenplay." Well, she said, "Try it." Well, lo and behold, the end result was "To Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar." The script was so clever, it was so sassy, it was so contemporary, it was so right on that the agent very smartly sent it to Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg read it, said, "This is one of the greatest comic scripts I've ever received," and he produced it. And it starred Patrick Swayze, and the movie became a very big hit. So here we have this irony. This young, poor, off-Broadway writer, Douglas Carter Beane, suddenly has become an A-plus screenwriter, making a very large sum of money. So he took a lot of the profits he made from that movie, and he put them into the creation of a dream he had called the Drama Department. And the Drama Department was an off-Broadway theater group that was dedicated to young artists who had written new works. It was for new directors and young, untried actors, many of them not in the union. And the Drama Department presented a series of over 40 shows over a period of time. And it was the beginning, it launched many actors, directors. Let me introduce a name that it launched. Christopher Ashley is the director of the show you'll be seeing, Xanadu. He also recently has just opened Memphis on Broadway, so a very successful director. He started his career at the Drama Department. He worked with Douglas Carter Beane on 9 projects, and he would become the director of the show you're seeing today. Okay, now, we have these 2 very sassy young men who are very cutting edge, who are very tuned in to what's happening off Broadway. And so they were in charge of creating the musical adaptation for the stage of Xanadu. Now, the producer made a very unfortunate statement. He said to Douglas Carter Beane, "You can do anything you want with the book." Well, you can't ever tell a young, clever writer that he can do whatever he wants. So lo and behold, that's exactly what Douglas Carter Beane did. And this led to the infamous workshop of this show that happened in New York. Keep in mind, you remember that the reason for a workshop is to raise money, to get a support group, to interest stars in working in the project. And so it's a very important introduction of the property. It's a way of testing it out, seeing what works and what doesn't work. So they brought together a very distinguished group of people to present the workshop. They used a young girl who had just won a Tony Award for 9. They used the young man who had just starred in All Shook Up. They were 2 very hot properties in New York, and they both appeared in the workshop. Well, the workshop was really very off the wall. Douglas Carter Beane decided that not only was he going to do a satire of the movie and make fun of the movie, but he was going to make fun of the times, meaning the 1980s. And so he took on 1980s music, 1980s movies, 1980s personalities. So within the story of Xanadu, we now had, in the workshop version, Nancy Reagan as a central character, and her astrologer, I might add, and Ronald Reagan, and Tammy Faye, and even a takeoff on the great choreographer Twyla Tharp. You saw her work, incidentally, in Moving Out. So in any case, it was a sort of off-the-wall workshop that was, of course, very funny in the tradition of Douglas Carter Beane, but it really had nothing to do with Xanadu. So the end result was everyone walked away from this workshop saying, the only thing we can say is it's worse than the movie. So at this point, Douglas Carter Beane realized that what he really had to do was to strip away all of the sort of satire he had created and to do a piece on the real story, which is a story of a goddess falling in love with a young man. And so he set out to do that, focusing on the love story, and he made a wonderful decision. Let me introduce a quote by Albert Camus. He said, "Myths are made for imagination to breathe life into them." Now, Camus realized that in every culture in the world, we use mythology to enhance our lives. So Douglas Carter Beane took this seriously. If you remember, if you saw the movie begins, the artist sketches in chalk on a wall the 9 muses from Greek mythology, and they come to life, and that's the basis of the movie. None of it is really developed. The muses are never developed. The mythology is never developed. So what happens in this wonderful take that Douglas Carter Beane had an epiphany about and used the Camus quote to really charge him with energy to create this film. He used this idea that mythology was the way to tell the story. We had already introduced the 9 muses, and so now what he had to do was to develop them. Just let me remind you that in Greek mythology, the muse was used to stimulate the artist. The muse, keep in mind the word museum comes from the word based on muse, meaning it's a shrine. A museum is a shrine to the muses. So it isn't the artist who painted a work. It isn't the sculptor who sculpted a work. It's the muse that the museum is honoring. We know in our own way, if you hear a contemporary writer and he's interviewed on Barbara Walters, and she'll say, well, where did you get the inspiration to do this? And he'll say, I channeled it, meaning that it came from somewhere else. It came from a higher power, a higher source. I mean, keep in mind, religion is based on this idea. And so the Greeks believed then that the muses would infuse an artist with a vision that would lead him to his art. And so this is what Douglas Carter Beane decided he was going to satirize in Xanadu. And for those of you who are fans of a wide range of things from opera to Gilbert and Sullivan, you'll find references in the show. For example, in Gilbert and Sullivan's Iolantha, there's the wonderful story of a fairy falling in love with a mortal. And that's what happens in this story. The Greek goddess falls in love with a young 1980s man in cut-off shorts who wants to have a roller disco. And so that idea really comes out of Iolantha. If you know Hans Christian Andersen, there are many references to The Little Mermaid and other tales of his. If you know the Cinderella story, of course, this whole show is the ultimate Cinderella story. Keep in mind, probably the most iconic moment in Cinderella is when she loses her slipper. And of course, the prince comes and puts it on her foot. Well, in this case, one of the delightful comic moments is when the young artist slips Kira's roller skate back on. So even Cinderella is well represented in this work. And those of you who are opera fans and Wagnerian fans, you'll see all kinds of references to the angry, steaming goddesses, especially late in the work. So what I'm suggesting to you is, this is a show where the only serious thing you're going to decide is if you're really going to buy roller skates after the show. That's about as serious as the show gets. But what it's going to do in the true tradition of musical comedy is to entertain you, delight you, give you a sense of fun, give you a sense of satire, and it makes for a very diverting evening. Keep in mind, right now, Broadway is on the brink of doing very serious, very dark musicals. The Scarsborough Boys, written by Kandra Nebb, is just about to open, about racism and the notion of young black boys being accused of raping a white woman. It was a very famous trial, and it's a very dark piece that they've done as a minstrel show. There are 9 new shows, musicals, opening especially off-Broadway that deal with very dark themes. We may want very much to come back to the diversion of musical comedy that we see in Xanadu. So for what is the best thing I can suggest to you, just sit back, relax, and listen to the delightful music and follow the frivolous, funny story as we move through the dream of the goddess and the young man connecting. One final thought. If those of you are really movie buffs, some of you may remember an old movie called The Clash of the Titans. It starred Laurence Olivier and Maggie Smith, and it dealt with the idea of the gods, as great thinkers, which was, of course, the basis of Greek mythology. The Clash of Titans is very strongly satirized. You'll see a segment in the film where the young man can't resolve the problems. He loves the goddess loves him, but the gods are not going to allow this to happen. So he decides to take things into his own hands and go up to Zeus' heaven. And when he gets there and he confronts Zeus, it is a scene exactly out of Clash of the Titans. One footnote for you, those of you who really are Greek scholars will remember that in Greek comedy 5 centuries BC, when a comedy by Aristophanes got too complicated, at the end of the comedy, when everything was so mixed up, no one ever knew how it was going to resolve itself, they would have a device called the Deus ex machina, which meant God of the machine. And what would happen is a god would be lowered in a crane and literally say, okay, you kiss her, you marry him, everyone will live happily ever after. So whenever we use that device now, whenever anything contrived happens at the end of the show to quickly resolve it, very savvy critics will use the phrase Deus ex machina, meaning God of the machine, meaning that someone comes in to resolve the problem at the end. And that's exactly what happens, and it's exactly what's satirized at the end of Xanadu. So a very funny take on a famous movie, Clash of Titans, a very funny take on an ancient classic tradition in comedy, the Deus ex machina, the sudden resolution, so that everyone, of course, has to live happily ever after. What else could happen in a roller disco? Well, I hope you enjoy the show. We have a little prize for one of you, a $10 gift certificate for Starbucks. Tony will announce the winner. And please enjoy your evening. And I so look forward to being with you live the next time we meet. Thank you very much.